Hello and welcome to You with Jesus. We're tracking the movements of Jesus in the last week of his life, and we come in this episode to the meal of the Passover, where Jesus celebrates a meal that had been celebrated by Jews for centuries prior to this, and a meal which has much significance also for Christians today when we talk about the Lord's Supper. Let's come and have a look at the passage. On the first day of the festival of unleavened bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb, Jesus' disciples asked him, "Where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" So he sent two of his disciples, telling them, "Go into the city and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. Say to the owner of the house he enters, 'The teacher asks, where is my guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there." The disciples left, went into the city and found things just as Jesus had told them, so they prepared the Passover. When evening came, Jesus arrived with the 12. While they were reclining at the table eating, he said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." They were saddened, and one by one they said to him, "Surely you don't mean me." "It is one of the 12, he replied, "one who dips bread into the bowl with me. The Son of Man will go, just as it is written about him. But woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born." While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take it, this is my body." Then he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many," he said to them. "Truly I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. The Jewish Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread were closely linked. One marks the beginning of the other. So some short historical context is essential here. The Jewish Passover commemorates the Israelites' liberation from slavery thousands of years before in ancient Egypt. And it's narrated in the book of the Exodus. The Israelites had lived in Egypt for generations, initially welcomed during the time of Joseph, but over time a new Pharaoh, who didn't know Joseph, enslaved the Israelites and subjected them to harsh labor. And God appointed Moses to lead God's people out of bondage. And Moses repeatedly demanded that Pharaoh let the Israelites go. But Pharaoh refused. And so in response, God sends a series of 10 plagues upon Egypt, each showing his divine power and pressuring Pharaoh to relent. And the 10th and final plague was the death of every Egyptian firstborn. And that was the turning point. And Pharaoh says, "Okay, go, get out of here." And to protect the Israelites from this plague, God instructed each of the households to slaughter a lamb and mark their doorposts with the blood of the lamb. And this sign signaled to the angel of death to pass over those homes, sparing the firstborn in those homes. Inside, the families were eating lamb roasted with bitter herbs and unleavened bread, which they called matzah. And they were to eat it quickly. They were to be dressed for travel, anticipating a sudden departure. And this meal became the prototype for the Passover meal, which was celebrated in Jesus' day and is still celebrated by Jews around the world. Then when Pharaoh finally orders the Israelites to leave, they depart in haste, not allowing time for the bread to rise, hence the ongoing Passover tradition of avoiding leaven when they're making the bread. And Pharaoh pursues them. They get to the Red Sea where the Israelites escape and the Egyptian army was overwhelmed. Passover thus came to embody these themes of liberation, divine justice, covenant, identity, and gratitude. And the Exodus story in each Passover meal would be retold, and ritual foods and symbolic actions, such as eating the matzah, tasting bitter herbs, and drinking wine, would help the participants reenact the experience and transmit the meaning to future generations. So by the time of Jesus, Passover was one of Judaism's pilgrimage festivals. Then the central ritual at Jerusalem would be the slaughter of the Passover lamb. It had to be offered on the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan in the Hebrew calendar. and the priests at the temple would oversee the sacrifice. So families or groups would bring their lamb, and after it was slaughtered, they would take it home to their lodging in Jerusalem to roast and eat it at the evening meal. Now, the Passover meal today is similar, but not exactly the same. They're obviously not going to the temple to have their lamb slaughtered, but it's very similar. Lots of elements are still present in the Passover meal that Jews celebrate today. So let's look at Jesus and the Passover. Jesus probably in some divine kind of way had already organized the room in which his disciples would be celebrating the Passover. And when evening came, they all gathered and, for the most part, there's nothing different about this Passover than all the others that they'd been at since they were children, except on a couple of vital points. When Jesus takes the bread and gives thanks and breaks it and gives it to his disciples, he says, "Take it, this is my body." This unleavened bread was obviously without leaven. In the Jewish law, leaven often represented decay or corruption, and leaven was actually used as a metaphor for sin. So like leaven, sin spreads, permeates, ferments, and makes an impact, but not in a good way. And Jesus says, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees, the teaching that corrupts and ruins society. Interesting, the grain offerings in the temple, which they had in the Old Testament, weren't to contain any leaven. No yeast was permitted on the altar of any sacrifice. The unleavened bread represented a break from the old life of slavery, a new beginning under God, and purity and consecration. Jesus is without a corruptive nature. He is unleavened. His influence is only good. He is the perfect, unblemished, incorruptible Son of God, and his death on the cross, his body in that death would be the perfect sacrifice for sin. And the unleavened bread also represents haste. They didn't have time to wait for the bread to rise back in the first Passover. So they were only to eat unleavened bread on that night and all the nights since when they're remembering it. And of course, there's that same element of haste in the meal that Jesus shares with his disciples. His death was coming quickly. Deliverance was very near. They needed to be ready to go. You can hear the element of haste when it says in John, as soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. So Jesus told him, what you are about to do quickly. Then Jesus moves on to the cup. And when he had given thanks, he gave it to them and they all drank from it. Again, nothing unusual there. But then he says, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Luke adds, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Matthew adds, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. The symbolism of the wine in the Jewish Passover was very rich and went back thousands of years. Two aspects in particular that I want to pick up on. One was this idea of covenant. As the wine is given to the participants, it represents God's side of the covenant, his promise to his people to rescue them from slavery, deliver them from Egypt and take them to be his prized possession. Wine was also used in Jewish temple worship to represent forgiveness. These drink offerings accompanied the sacrifices to point to God's ultimate redemption, his atonement and forgiveness. And Jesus takes those two elements that we've looked at just now, his covenant with his people, his commitment to them, and his forgiveness, and says, this wine is my blood that I will pour out for you. And he inaugurates a new covenant of redemption and forgiveness. And by offering his body in death, the bread, and the shedding of blood, the wine, the need for ongoing sacrifices is done away with. Jesus is the final and complete statement of God's covenant of forgiveness with us. Jesus had said, do this in remembrance of me. So Christians have taken this Jewish Passover and they've Jesusified it. They've got Jesus in the middle of it, and he is the bread and the wine. And at first it was in the context of a normal meal when they would meet in homes for church, many years before church buildings became a thing. And over the course of several hundred years, it became this believer's meal became separate from the main meal as a specific ceremony featuring only the bread and the wine. Personally, I've loved sharing the bread and wine around a table in the context of a meal with a group of fellow believers. That's my favourite way to celebrate the Lord's Supper. I remember when my son was about 5 years of age, And we were sitting down for the evening meal, nothing fancy, although my wife and I poured ourselves a glass of red wine. And my son looks over his glass of juice and he looks up at us and he very sincerely asks, "Are you remembering?" And I was confused by what he was saying. And I'm like, "Remembering what?" And he says, "Remembering that Jesus died for you." Well, they do say out of the mouths of babes. And I have to say that was one of those moments. And even today, if I pour a glass of wine, I try to remember God's blessings, remember his faithfulness, and remember all that he has secured for me. See you in the next episode.